Good morning. We're going to pick right back up in chapter 4. And Peter had said last week to us, he said, listen, if you're going through some sufferings because of being a Christian, it's normative. Learn even to rejoice in it. Don't be shocked by it. Let's pick up now in verse 14. He's going to talk about some of the kinds of sufferings we may experience. He says, if you're insulted because in the name of Christ, you're blessed, for the Spirit of glory and of God rests on you. So an insult would be one way. He says in verse 15, if you suffer, it should not be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. I like that word, meddler. However, if you suffer as a Christian, do not be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. And we'll just stop there. We'll just go to verse 14 through 16. So the first thing he says is it's conceivable that just for being a Christian, you may be insulted. Now, this is really pretty relevant today because we Christians are more and more being kind of stereotyped as being sort of narrow, out of step with societal change, cranky. We're even sometimes called haters. We're looked upon as being argumentative and narrow-minded and sexually repressive and all sorts of things. So it is not an unusual thing to be insulted for just being a Christian or just saying you're a Christian. We know that even our TV shows and some movies and things really depict Christians in a most unfavorable light. So Peter is telling us, he says, look, don't be upset about that. It just is indicative that you're blessed. You're living consistent with the one that you say you're following. That's verse 14. Verse 15, he says, if you do suffer, though, and here's where he's got some pertinent advice, too. He says, it should not be as a murderer or a thief or any other kind of criminal or even as a meddler. So Peter is saying, listen, don't get confused about this. We can bring a lot of suffering on ourselves, and it has nothing to do with Christ. Sometimes we say things we shouldn't say. Sometimes we have an attitude that's negative or combative. We don't want to get into a pity party and start saying, well, I'm just suffering as a Christian. No, I might be suffering because I haven't developed good social skills, or I may be suffering because I'm offensive. Perhaps I don't know it, but I am. So Peter is saying, kind of check yourself out and make sure you're not suffering for the wrong reasons, that you're not suffering, excuse me, as a consequence of some sort of sin. But then he says in verse 16, he says, however, if you suffer as a Christian, don't be ashamed, but praise God that you bear that name. So we want to make sure that when we are undergoing suffering or friction, that it's not because of some character trait in ourselves that needs to be cleansed, that needs to be developed, that we haven't, in other words, brought it on ourselves because we're being a little bit combative or obnoxious in some way, but that it's purely because we're living according to the word and will of God. We're totally identifying with Christ. So Peter is very balanced in this, that he wants us to know suffering is normative, but let's make sure that we're not attributing suffering that we bring on ourselves because of sin or sinful traits as something that's the result of our identification with Christ. Well, I hope you're not suffering for being a murderer or a thief or anything like that today. And I'll see you next week.